of that. Okay, cool. Okay, so we'll get going on the webinar. Thanks for that, guys. It's nice to know that there are actually some people out there. Oh, I need to click away from the chat. Okay, so overview, rationale of the webinar. We're working, living, experiencing really uncertain, volatile times at the moment. As an example, within the first 3 months of 2020, we've had Brexit, which has kicked off, which has got uncertain, unknown consequences. We've got extreme weather events, the flooding in the UK. We've had fire events over in Australia. Obviously, we've got the COVID-19 situation that's going on at the moment as well. And the point of all of these events, and within your organisations, you'll be having events that are happening all the time outside of those which have uncertain outcomes. And there's an increasing level of volatility and an increasing level of turbulence, which seems to be becoming the norm within the workplace. And the reason for suggesting putting this webinar on for Cambridge Network is that risk management is the primary focus. The reason for doing risk management effectively is trying to quantify and identify and plan and manage that uncertainty and manage the unknown. I mean, obviously there are some things you just can't know, so you can't plan for the completely unknown. But the point of risk management is to get yourself into a process of actually understanding and dealing with uncertainty. So this webinar is meant to be a short introduction and a simple practical guide for managing risk effectively. Okay. So, session objectives. We're going to identify a basic process. We're going to recognise risk as both a threat, i.e. a negative impact, and we're all seeing some of the negative impacts of the COVID-19 situation. We're all seeing negative impacts of all sorts of risks that happen within our working lives. However, the key for organisations to survive and thrive within this turbulent, volatile workplace is to actually identify some of the positive opportunities as well, and actually proactively address those positive opportunities or positive impacts. So we're going to keep focusing on the fact that risk can be a positive thing as well as a negative thing. And lastly, well, throughout the webinar, we're going to be looking at different ways of identifying, different ways of prioritising, and different ways of planning risk events, essentially. So, back over to you guys. Firstly, we're talking about risk here. I know what I think I know what risk means. Let's find out what you guys think. When I say risk and when I say risk view, what do you think that means? And also, some honest answers here. Who had a plan in place 2 months ago to proactively deal with COVID-19, or who is currently reacting to the situation? So it's a proactive versus reactive. Where are we at with that? So what do we mean by risk? Quick definition. Might be asking a lot for you in this, but let's have a go. And did you have a proactive or a reactive approach? Are you having a proactive or a reactive approach to COVID-19? Yeah, so good. Risk isn't something that has an uncertain outcome. Well, these go by quite quickly. A threat to normal operations, like Jackie J's, that's great, excellent. Potential to cause harm, absolutely. And just to pick out of that, when I'm talking about risk within this, being exposed to a problem, when I'm talking about risk here, when we talk about risk, we often think about health and safety, so risk assessments and health and safety and that kind of thing, and absolutely that is part of this process, but this is much more about risk to business, risk to operations, risk to some kind of objective. So is it going to delay or cause harm, or positively, is it going to maximize an opportunity? Heightened risk can be expected and unexpected, absolutely. What could go wrong? Rachel B, absolutely, but what could go right as well? Exposure is something which will cause harm and negative outcome, absolutely. So essentially, as we'll see in a moment, COVID is essentially the cause of potential risks, and that risk event is going to have either a positive impact on an outcome you're trying to achieve, or a negative, i.e. it doesn't happen. My background is project management, so I tend to think about this in terms of projects, and the risk is, are we going to be able to deliver this project on time? Are we going to be able to deliver it to the cost that we were expecting to? Are we going to be able to deliver it to the specification we were aiming to do? Absolutely. So risk is exposed. Somebody's doing actually an APM definition there. I like that. Risk is the exposure of stakeholders to the consequences of variations of outcomes. Somebody's done an APM qualification there. DWFNM gross. Excellent. I love that answer. So we've got an idea that risk is something that's going to cause a problem or potentially delay something or potentially increase something. So yeah, we've got a good understanding there. Just as a point, I didn't get too many in there, and I think we can go back through the chats. But it'd be interesting to see how many people had a kind of a plan in place, a way of dealing with it, or whether we're all just reacting now to the situation. And the point of risk management is that it is a dynamic process. So you can't plan for absolutely everything. You can't plan for all events and all eventualities. So the point is, risk management is a dynamic process. We find ourselves in a situation now and we need to deal with it. But the point is, you can do it in a considered way, or you can do it as a headless chicken way. And the aim of risk management is to do it as a positive, I'm planning and we're going to deal with this. As I've already said, the goal of risk management is to minimize negative impacts, maximize positive ones. And the approach should be appropriate and proportional. And what I mean by that is, sometimes a negative around risk management is that you can spend a lot of time doing it, but actually it should be appropriate to the size of the organization you work in, the size of the project or the activity you're working on. So don't spend too much time doing it, and it will be a really valuable exercise. Okay. Sorry, just give me a moment. I was going to read a couple of the comments. Okay, cool. Okay, so basic process. 4-stage process. What you want to do first is identify your risk events. We've got an idea of what we mean by a risk event now. Second stage is to prioritize. And there are different ways that we're going to look at in terms of prioritizing our risk events. Essentially, the prioritization piece is a way of assessing the risk and then rank ordering them. So you focus on the risks that you want to and need to focus on as priorities for your particular business. Then you've got a planning stage, and as we'll see, there are different ways of planning and different ways to respond to a risk and different outcomes depending on the different ways that you respond to risk. And then obviously the final part is the response. But the point here is, it's not a static activity. You don't do risk management at the beginning of something and then put it in a drawer and forget all about it. The point is it's a cycle. At any point you might identify different risks. Your responses to risks might bring out secondary risks. So you have to assess those and you need to plan effectively for them. But we're just going to go through next 15-20 minutes. We're just going to talk through these different stages and get a feel for how you guys feel that you might go about doing this. So first question, and within the identifier phase of risk management, how would you go about identifying risk within your organization? How would you go about identifying risk? And just as a short sentence or two, have you got any particular risks you're dealing with, you're addressing, you're planning for? So how do you identify risk, and how do you, and what sort of risks have you got? So managing students, keeping them safe. Brainstorms, definitely. MS work, iPad, I think you've got my list here. Weekly meetings, so you're bringing teams together to identify what your risks are, absolutely. Risk to personnel, risk to governance, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. How you identify risks is dependent on the type of risk, whether it's an operational risk or whether it's a revenue risk or a technical risk. Good. So identified area leads, so allocating responsibilities, good. The T from the SWOT, definitely. So we've got risks to revenue and to the team and the well-being of the team. Lessons learned, good. Pestle analysis, thanks Lucy. We identify risks at the planning stage, absolutely. And actually a really important point to come out of that, actually, when you talk about the planning stage, whether it's project management, whether it's risk management, the argument will always be invest the right amount of time into your planning, get the planning right, not as I say proportional and appropriate to the type of project you're working on, but get the planning stage right, and that gives you your best chance to progress with the activity or managing and dealing with the risk. Bacon roll and a coffee with individuals in a relaxed environment, absolutely. You're just talking to people, you're getting people's insight into what constitutes risk for your particular environment. And I'm guessing, perhaps a question I should have asked at the beginning actually, just to find out what kinds of organizations are within this session, because depending on the type of organization, the type of sector you work in, your risks are going to be different, how you'll identify them is going to be different. So this is just meant to be an overview guide rather than this is what you have to do within your particular area. Cool, so I've got some examples of how we will how you don't identify risks. So brainstorming, getting your teams together, that could be an informal or within a formal environment. Really important with brainstorming is if you're going to do it and you're bringing people together, obviously there's a cost involved with that. You're bringing a team of people into an environment that needs to be facilitated effectively. It needs to be managed. Individuals within the brainstorming activity needs to be managed effectively as well. Generally speaking, and we'll know this when we've worked within groups, you'll have extroverted individuals, some who are happy to talk, happy to put their opinions forward, some people who are more introverted and not quite so happy to put their ideas forward. But that's not to say that those introverted individuals don't have a really valid important points to put across. So the facilitator, the people managing it, need to make sure they're doing that effectively, so that they get all of the right ideas and the right opinions. Experience and knowledge, everybody's already said that. You use the right people to identify what your risk events are, so you can deal with them effectively. I think Lucy mentioned the pestle analysis. For anybody who hasn't seen the pestle analysis, it's a tool for analysing environmental factors or external factors to your organisation. The P is for political, the E is for economic, the S is for social, the T is for technological, the L is for legal, the E is for environmental, and it's a way of exploring all of those types of factors and what might have an impact on your business. So using the COVID situation, you've got there's political factors that are coming into play here, the restrictions that we're being put under, and the social elements. Technology is going to be factoring in there. With everybody and their dog are now getting online and producing content so that we can communicate effectively and we can still continue to work effectively. Big changes in work practices are going to be coming as a result of this, and as we hopefully people will start to see some really positive changes to work practices, positive factors from an environmental point of view, for example. SWOT analysis, so strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. Somebody mentioned within the chat The T particularly here is the threats. As a business, you're looking at what things are going to threaten your business, you being able to operate, being able to achieve whatever outcomes you're trying to achieve. But the other things in there as well, you should be looking at your weaknesses within internal weaknesses within your organisation, areas for development. I prefer to call them rather than weaknesses. It's more of a positive slant on it. But also, let's be positive. What are the opportunities? So, as an example, Marshall Centre as a business, we're looking at, as a number of different, well, in fact, probably all training type centres and organisations will be doing. We're looking at the ways that we can diversify our delivery style and give our training in a range of different ways. And actually, that's a really positive thing, because we'll be able to deliver training to a broader range of people. So a SWOT analysis is another good way of identifying risk within your organisation. Something else I've just got in here as well is the structuring your risk as a risk description rather than just purely identifying what the risk is. It's almost like a mini root cause analysis. So what you're doing is you're considering what the cause of the risk is. So you're analysing that piece. You're actually identifying the risk event, and then what the outcome, the impact of that is, whether that be positive or negative. And it's quite a nice way of just making sure you're considering the right elements of the risk. So that's a useful thing to do as well. Okay, so that's about it in terms of the identification phase. As a suggestion, and again, it's appropriate and proportional. When you're doing your identification, you may well come up with 50, 100, 200 different risks, and the decision around, or the factors that will bear on that will be the risk appetite of individuals and organisations. So it's quite possible to come up with a lot of risk events and get yourself a bit bogged down with having to analyse all those events, having to think that you've got to plan for them, address them, do some kind of action around them. So a good sort of guide would be to make sure that your identification phase might come out with lots of risks, but what you want to do is you want to identify a sort of a core set of risks that you want to go on to analyse and prioritise, because so you can get a bit bogged down with a list that's too long, essentially, if you don't. So 5 to 10 that would go forward into your prioritisation, go onto your risk log if you're going to create a risk log, which I recommend you do. And so that your list isn't too large, but it's focused on the right risks for you as an organisation, or as an individual, as a business. Okay, so prioritisation. For the people who've obviously done some kind of APN course and know the risk management process within that, this would be known as the assessment phase. So how would you go about prioritising your risks? This is over to you now, guys. Absolutely right, MS. The balance between projects and business as usual risk is a tricky balance at times. Based on the impact they stand to have, absolutely, impact is going to be a really important factor. Value in terms of money, proximity and scale of impact. And proximity, we mean how close it is to us. The likelihood, this is it, we're getting all the important things here. So we've got the likelihood, we've got the impact, we've got the proximity. Anything else? How else might you prioritise? Any tools? Anybody aware of any tools out there? Impact on customer, yeah. Cost to implement versus cost if impact is effective? Absolutely. Score the chances versus impact. Chances versus impact, absolutely. So probability versus impact. Impact on benefit realization. Impact on financials, product delivery, people impact, definitely. Trajectory of risk, where it's going, I guess that means. The potential over a period of time. Okay, yeah, so depending on where you're at. And Adam, the trajectory of risk and impending receding, absolutely. So the point here is risk management as a cycle. You may well dip into an activity that's happening, and it may well be a risk that's just ramping up. It may well be a risk that's just going out, and depending on your answer to what that is will depend on how much effort you put into your response to that risk. Excellent. So one way, very simple. Remember, we're looking at risk management as a dynamic process which supports your business. We all have some understanding of our business. So our own expert professional judgment should factor in terms of how we prioritize. Then you're going to have some tools and some techniques, ways of visually demonstrating how you're doing your risk. So a simple red, amber, green rating, a RAG, that can be a very visual way. If you've got a list of risks that you want to sort of focus and prioritize on, and then demonstrate to a team of people how and why you are. That's a very simple visual way of looking at it. Urgent versus important matrix. So for me, that is it's sort of used more within time management, known as the Eisenhower matrix, and I've got a couple of visuals at the moment which are going to demonstrate this. But I also feel that actually it's a really useful way of doing a simple, quick assessment of your risk activity, and I'll explain why in a moment. You've got your probability impact grid. So a lot of people have said, your probability versus impact, you want to know those two things. What's the impact? How much is it going to cost? How much is it going to delay what we do? How much is it going to affect the specification of what we're trying to deliver, or the quality of what we're trying to deliver? Health and safety is another factor in there. And the probability is how likely it is. So for example, something that's got a very high impact but a very low probability, you'll have a different approach to that compared to something that's got a high probability, low impact, for example. But you've got to make your judgment calls around that. Another thing to bring into the mix at this stage is recognizing, and this should also be applied at the identification phase as well, is human biasing influences. Individuals, we are influenced and biased by our own attitudes and values and beliefs, and our own experiences. Teams, biasing can happen within teams, mentioned before, in terms of a brainstorming environment. Somebody who's quite extrovert may well be seen as more of a leader, so their ideas may well take more sway than somebody who's introverted, but actually the opinions might be more or less valid, and you need to be aware of these things. Organizations can be biased. You might work within an organization that's very risk averse, and if you work in an environment that's very risk averse, then your gradings and ratings of probability and impact will probably be higher, just because there's a natural tendency to be like that. And obviously you've got the environmental influence as well. So just to bear that in mind. So the next thing I want to do is just have a quick look at the urgent versus important matrix and the probability impact matrix. I'm just going to minimize my chat. So urgent versus important. What you're looking at is, how important is that? Is an activity or a risk, and how urgent is it? How urgent is your response to it? And if something is urgent and important, then obviously that needs to be dealt with some urgency. So you can see that's going to be a priority focus. You're going to invest more resource in it. You're going to prioritize it in terms of the time frame you respond to it. Whereas something that is important but not urgent may well be able to be factored in a longer time frame. However, often what you find is the things that are important but are not urgent will actually longer term have a more of a positive impact. So you want to push those things forward as much as possible. But often they just get pushed back because they're not staring you in the face and they're not urgent. They need to be dealt with right then. Urgent but not important. I mean, the display mentions about delegating it to somebody else, but from the point of view of just having a way of prioritizing your risk events, it may well be you haven't got the luxury of being able to delegate it to somebody else, but it needs to be responded to, and it needs to be planned effectively. Things that aren't important and aren't urgent, don't need to worry about those at all. A much more common risk analysis technique is the probability impact grid, so the one on the right hand side. And here we've got a very simple matrix which grades your probability down the left axis and the vertical axis, the impact across the horizontal axis. And you've got a grading from either 1 to 5 or very low, very high. You can build in a lot more scaled versions of this, but for the purpose of this session, it's just useful to know that to have a way of rank ordering your risk events. So you basically, the way that you use the tool is to multiply the probability by the impact. So a very low impact, a very low probability gives you a ranking of 1 or a score of 1. A very high impact versus a very high probability gives you a score of 25. Pretty obviously, if you saw those two risk events together, you would be focusing on your one that scores 25 compared to your one that scores 1. However, if you've got a list of 10 different risk events that you're not quite sure which ones to focus on first, you can use that scaling just to give you a rank order and to give you a little bit more clarity. Bring it back in though, the biasing of individuals. I'm quite a risk-seeking individual. I know that some colleagues I work with are more risk-averse. So we would probably come up with slightly different gradings. And a simple way to get over that is you get your team of people to do the risk assessment, to complete the grid, and you work out some kind of averaged mean average of those scores to give you possibly a balanced scoring of your probability impact. Okay, so that's the urgent versus important matrix, probability impact matrix. Within project management and risk management, the probability impact matrix is a very commonly used matrix to rank order and prioritize your risk events. Okay. So we've looked at the identification phase, different ways of identifying risk. We've had a quick look at some of your risks and how you have responded to COVID. We've looked at different ways of prioritizing, some very simple, some very basic. Say the point of risk management as a practical thing should be, it shouldn't be onerous, it shouldn't be cumbersome, you shouldn't be spending forever filling in forms and trying to do assessments and analysis. It should be appropriate and responsive to what you need as an organization. So we looked at identification, we looked at the prioritization stage. Now we're on to plan. So when you're planning how to respond to risk, so remember, risk isn't something that's happened. COVID isn't a risk now, that's a cause, it's happened, we know it's happened. It's the events that come out of that we're going to need to, that are going to cause risks for us. Some of those risks might happen, some of those risks might not happen. So question for you guys, what do you think you need to consider when you're responding to risk? Impact on staff, absolutely. What resources you need, definitely. People's feelings, like it. Cost, impact and deliverables. No regret actions and spend. What do you mean by no regret actions and spend? Harriet? Whether your risk mitigation efforts will create risk elsewhere, so secondary risks, absolutely. We're going to talk a little bit about what we mean by the difference between contingency and mitigation as well in a moment. Employee well-being, yeah. The time, the people, the resources, the practicality, definitely. 4 T's. Adam, help me out there. What do you mean by 4 T's? I feel like I should know that. Transfer, treat, tolerate, terminate. Okay, I'll look into that one. Haven't heard that one before. Okay. So some of the things I've got that you need to think about when you're responding, when you're planning how to respond to your risks. Everyone's perspective will be different, absolutely, Jenny. Okay, so, threats and opportunities. Again, when you're talking about risk, everybody will go to a more, a negative slant on it, but are there positive opportunities that can come from this? And one of the arguments I would have in this situation is, at the beginning we said we're living in turbulent times. I don't think those turbulent times change. I know this is quite an extreme version of it, what we're being required to do in terms of responding to COVID-19. However, the rapid change in the way that we use technology within the work environment, for example, that rapid change isn't going to change anytime soon. So we as organisations and individuals and businesses need to be able to respond really effectively to that and positively and take advantage of those opportunities. So it's probably more important in that kind of environment. Yes, we need to deal with the threats and the risk events because it's going to close our business if we don't do that effectively. But actually, taking advantage of positive opportunities is really important too. Mitigation. So one way of responding to risk. Mitigation means you're going to do something to try to reduce or remove the impact of that, or make it more likely if it's a positive impact. Compare that to contingency. So that's kind of doing nothing, accepting the risk as it is, but planning in case of something happening. This will be based on how you've prioritized and how you've assessed your risks. But you may well decide if it's, for example, a low probability, low-ish impact, something that's got very high impact, you'd probably want to do something about it. But something that is a medium impact, that actually, we can see how it pans out. We won't do anything about it now. We'll accept the risk, but we'll have a plan in place, maybe a pot of money in place to be able to deal with that effectively. As a number of people have mentioned, you need to make sure that you're allocating sufficient resources to be able to deal with it. That's all in terms of time, money, people, equipment, all types of resources. You also need to make sure you're allocating responsibility, so ownership of responsibility to each of your risks. That means that if that risk actually comes to pass, it comes to fruition, somebody is in a position immediately to be able to deal with it and respond to it effectively. Really important to make sure that happens. It may well be, depending on the level of this, if you're a small team, this may well be just contained within each of your heads, how you're going to deal with it. But at any kind of size, it would be useful to have a risk log. And really, this risk log, if you deal with it effectively, becomes an action plan for your business. It should be just tied into your wider business plan or your action plan, project management plan. And next is just a little example of a very basic risk log where you've got the type of, I'm not going to go through these examples, the slides can come out, but it's just a visual example of a risk log where you've got your risk type, you've got your risk description, so the cause, the event and the impact, you've got your grading, whether you've used a red, amber, green, or whether you've used a scoring, or if you're going to use your urgent versus important, you could just do a little an acronym in there to sort of say, just to visually show how you're prioritizing these risk events. And then you've got your action plan. So is it a mitigation action you're going to be doing, or is it a contingency plan? But you can document those things. It may well be you've got both. You've got a mitigation action, you're going to try to reduce it, but then you can have another plan in place to be able to respond effectively, depending on the severity of how the risk actually occurs. And then towards the end there, you've got your the owner of the risk. very simple, very straightforward. As I said before, 5 to 10 high risk events for a typical. This isn't prescriptive. I'm not saying you should have 5 to 10. It will depend on the type of work you are working on entirely. I don't know exactly what audience we've got here and the types of organisations you work in, but you don't want it to be too large, but you also don't want it to be too small either, because it's not going to be effective. So, and when you get the slides come out, you can see these are actually some of the risk events that our organisation is currently going through, in terms of the impact of COVID, in terms of potential lost revenue, potential reduction in delivery, as a negative, but as a positive, actually it's giving us the opportunity to deliver this kind of program where we're doing it remotely, and I'm sitting in my front room, which is lovely. So there's all sorts of positive and negative impacts of risk, and it will depend on the types of people who are inputting into it, how you are identifying, prioritising, and then planning and responding to those events. Okay. So you've identified, you've prioritised, you've planned. Now there's going to be the response. Obviously, from a contingency point of view, you would respond when and if the event actually comes about. But if you've decided you're going to do some mitigation activity, what sort of things do you think you'd want to be considering? There's a question to you guys now. So when you're responding, anything else? Adam, your question, would I treat risk events as business as usual or as separate project working group with delegated governance? It will depend entirely on the governance of your organisation, how it treats it. It depends on the relationships and the interdependencies between if you're talking about a project. So not really, it will depend on the context is the answer to the question. The purpose of today's risk isn't purely focused on risk project management, I guess is the answer to that question. It's meant to be just risk management in general terms as well. Yeah, so Terry, what are your intended outcome needs to be? Do you revert to plan or use the opportunity to modify plans for the better? Absolutely. And that brings in this idea of it being a dynamic process. It shouldn't be well, we've done our plan at the beginning and that's it, we'll leave it. It should be there should be a constant review. You'd want to identify your dependencies, absolutely. Damage control process, absolutely. Sustainable response, is there enough resource to complete the mitigation? Absolutely, that's got to be part of the planning. The dilemma there you've got though is if you've identified that the impact of the risk is so high that it's a showstopper, but the cost of dealing with it is also a showstopper, you've got an issue there. So let's start looking at some of the positive opportunities. Okay, so I've not gone quite into the sort of the project-y context with my response piece here. It's more about when you do your response, you need to review the response that you have had. You need to review, you need to keep monitoring the costs of your response, the timeframes. If you decided a mitigation action, then that's actually become a part of your plan. This is part of what you're doing. You need to be monitoring the effectiveness of your responses. Are they having the positive or the positive impact you're expecting them to have? Somebody's already mentioned, are there going to be any secondary or follow-on risks from the mitigation action you've done? By putting in place a mitigation action, you're changing your original plans. So is there some kind of secondary risk? Does that secondary risk need to go through the risk management cycle? You've done the identification, you've identified the secondary risk, but does it need to be prioritised and assessed and analysed and then planned for and built into the budget and the schedules and things like that? as I say, the point of your this stage, obviously, depending on the nature of the response, depending on the nature of the risk, and depending on the nature of your organisation, will bear heavily on the types of responses that you have. But risk management, dynamic process, there should be a cycle of yes, identify, yes, prioritize, yes, plan, yes, respond. But at any point around that cycle, it may well be you need to go back to the beginning. It may well be you need to reevaluate and monitor and review. So that's what it means by a kind of a cyclical, dynamic process that doesn't stand still, essentially. Okay, so in terms of a general risk management process, sorry I wasn't able to respond to all of the messages. They came through quite thick and fast there, so it's quite difficult responding to the chat and also trying to sort of deliver the slides. But in terms of a general process, that's kind of a general practical risk management process. So obviously Marshall Centre are a training provider. We have some other opportunities. Apologies for this. We're just going to close down now. There's an opportunity for asking questions. I'm going to leave it open for asking questions at the end. But some of the other elements that Marshall offer in terms of what's the next steps in terms of risk management, we're going to be offering a more substantial half-day workshop with smaller groups of people so that it can be a bit more intimate and we can engage and we can actually look at perhaps creating risk management plans and action risk logs for individuals. This is obviously just been a kind of an introduction to that. So I haven't got the full details on that. I'm going to put that out through Sarah and Sarah with the Cambridge Network. So watch this space if you're interested in doing something a bit more substantial around what we did today, but actually produces a result for you in terms of a risk log and an action plan. Obviously, we can offer bespoke in-house support. We're actually an accredited centre for Association for Project Management. So for anybody who's interested in getting an accredited programme, accredited qualification in risk management, we offer those as well. And all of these things we are currently in the process of adapting to online delivery. So there'll be virtual delivery for the accredited stuff, as well as our kind of bespoke open workshops. And essentially, if you want to get in touch with me, or if you want to ask any questions, my contact details are on the bottom there. We've got the Marshall Centre website there. But in terms of today's session, the sort of 5-10 minutes at the end, is there any specific questions that you had? I'm essentially done, so thank you very much for attending. That's okay, no problem. Thank you for coming. Thank you, thank you. That's all right, no worries. It was an interesting experience for me too. Good, glad you found it useful. Okay, Adam, contact me. Vaguely an APM member. How are you vaguely an APM member? Not sure how that works. You are. But yeah, Adam, contact me. Absolutely delighted to have a conversation with you. Good. Thank you for your feedback. Appreciate that. Let's say I'm keen to talk to anybody and everybody about these things. So we only had a quick scan through a very simple, practical process that you could use now. But there's all sorts of other tools and techniques and processes and levels that you can go into with this. So it was a pleasure delivering it, and thanks very much for your comments. And okay, Adam. Oh, listen, I look forward to hearing that long story. Yeah, give us a buzz. Yeah, so other courses that APM deliver, we also offer the project fundamentals, project management qualifications. And as I say, as with the risk management, we're also going to be adapting those ready for virtual delivery within the next few weeks. So on our website, pretty much most of the content we deliver there in terms of our programs are going to be adapted for online content in these trying times.
I'm just going to jump in, if I may.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you to you, Steve. That was great. Really, really informative session. So thank you for delivering that for us. Also, just want to mention again, if anyone joined late, I did say at the beginning that we are able to share the recording and the presentation of this session. So if you do want to catch up with the full thing, it'll be available on YouTube later this afternoon. And if there are no more questions, then I think we can end there. And if you've got any other things you need to mention, Steve?
No, not at all. Like I say, if anything, any questions or any queries or any discussion, then just give us a buzz or contact us through Cambridge Network. But thanks very much for coming along. Appreciate that.
Great. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to log off now. So goodbye, and I'll see you soon.
Cheers, Sarah.